June 19, 1944. 1,347 hours. 23,000 feet above the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Saburō Nakajima sits in the cockpit of his A6M5 Zero, watching 12 American Hellcats climb toward his formation like sharks sensing blood in the water. He has been flying combat missions for 22 months. He has seen 94 men from his original training class die. He knows the mathematics of this engagement with the certainty of a man who has survived by understanding exactly how outmatched he is. 12 Hellcats versus 8 Zeros. American fighters with 2,000 horsepower engines versus Japanese fighters with 1,130. 6.50 caliber machine guns per Hellcat versus two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns per Zero. Armored cockpits versus fabric-covered fuselages. Self-sealing fuel tanks versus tanks that burn like kerosene torches when hit. The Americans can dive faster, climb faster, absorb more damage, and fire more ammunition. The Zero can turn tighter and climb more efficiently at altitude. That's it. That's all Nakajima has. And today, even that won't be enough. The American formation splits. 4 Hellcats dive from above. 4 climb from below. 4 come straight in from the side. It's a textbook hammer and anvil attack, executed with the casual precision of pilots who know they hold every advantage. Nakajima's squadron leader gives the order to scatter. Break formation. Every pilot for himself. Try to outmaneuver the Americans one-on-one and hope your superior turning ability saves you. It won't. Nakajima knows it won't because he's seen this scenario 27 times in the past year, and each time, the Japanese pilots who tried to turn fight their way out died screaming as American .50 caliber rounds shredded their aircraft into burning debris. The Americans don't turn fight anymore. They learned. They dive, shoot, climb away. Boom and zoom tactics that exploit their speed and firepower while avoiding prolonged turning engagements. Against this doctrine, Japanese turning superiority is useless. Nakajima has 3 seconds to decide whether to follow orders and die predictably, or to do something that every instructor at Chuchiura Air Training School explicitly forbade. Something that violates every principle of energy management, formation discipline, and aircraft handling he was taught. Something that should kill him instantly but might give him a chance. What Lieutenant Saburō Nakajima doesn't know is that in the next 8 seconds, he will execute a maneuver so counterintuitive, so structurally dangerous, that American ace pilots will report it to naval intelligence believing they'd witnessed a mechanical failure, not a deliberate tactical choice. That his maneuver will be classified by U.S. Navy analysts as aerodynamically implausible evasive action. That 79 years later, aerospace engineers will simulate what he did and conclude it should have torn his aircraft apart. And that the reason it worked, the reason he survived, has nothing to do with courage or skill, and everything to do with one desperate man's willingness to break every rule because the rules were already killing everyone who followed them. By June 1944, the air war in the Pacific had become a mathematical inevitability. The Japanese had started the war with the finest carrier-based fighter in the world, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. Longer range than American fighters. Better climbing ability. Superior maneuverability. Lighter, faster at altitude, capable of outturning anything the United States Navy could field. In the first 6 months of the war, Zero pilots had dominated the Pacific skies. At Pearl Harbor, at Wake Island, at the Philippines, Japanese fighters shredded American aircraft with an ease that approached massacre. The Zero could engage at ranges American fighters couldn't reach. It could turn inside American turning circles. It could climb away from danger and dive back in at will. American pilots who survived those early encounters reported fighting an opponent that seemed to operate under different laws of physics. But warfare is evolution compressed into months instead of millennia. Survival favors adaptation. The Americans studied captured Zeros. They ran wind tunnel tests. They interviewed survivors. They identified the Zero's advantages and, more importantly, its weaknesses. No armor. No self-sealing fuel tanks. Fragile construction optimized for weight reduction. Engine that cut out during negative G maneuvers due to float carburetor design. Limited ammunition capacity. Poor high-speed handling. By 1943, American fighter doctrine had evolved to exploit every one of these weaknesses. The Grumman F6F Hellcat embodied this evolution, a fighter designed specifically to kill Zeros using tactics Zeros couldn't counter. The Hellcat was heavier, stronger, more powerful. It couldn't turn with a Zero, but it didn't need to. Hellcat pilots were trained in the thatch weave, a mutual support tactic where pairs of fighters covered each other, preventing Japanese pilots from exploiting their turning advantage. They used boom-and-zoom attacks, diving from altitude, firing a devastating burst of 6.50 caliber machine guns, then climbing away before the Zero could turn to engage. Against this evolved doctrine, Japanese fighters were dying at a rate that defied sustainability. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the engagement that would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American pilots would shoot down 350 Japanese aircraft while losing only 30 of their own. The kill ratio had inverted. In 1942, Japanese pilots had been predators. By 1944, they were prey. Japanese doctrine hadn't evolved. It couldn't. The institutional culture that produced the Zero and trained its pilots was built on principles that were incompatible with adaptation, absolute adherence to prescribed tactics, unwavering faith in aircraft superiority, and the assumption that fighting spirit could compensate for material disadvantage. Japanese training manuals for the A6M explicitly prohibited certain maneuvers considered too dangerous, too wasteful of altitude, or too likely to result in structural failure. These prohibitions were based on sound aeronautical engineering and combat experience. They were there for good reasons. But by June 1944, following those prohibitions meant dying predictably. Lieutenant Saburō Nakajima had watched enough men die to understand this truth. He knew that American pilots no longer feared the Zero's maneuverability because they'd learned to fight in ways that made maneuverability irrelevant. He knew that the doctrine he'd been trained to follow was a death sentence written by instructors who never faced Hellcats. And he knew that survival now required violating every principle those instructors had drilled into him. Saburō Nakajima was not supposed to be a fighter pilot. He was born in 1920 in Kumamoto Prefecture on Kyushu, the third son of a family that grew rice and raised silkworms. His future was predetermined: work the farm, marry a local girl, raise children who would work the farm after him. The Nakajima family had been farmers for 11 generations. There was no reason to expect the 12th generation would be different. But in 1938, the Imperial Japanese Navy came to Kumamoto recruiting for flight training. They needed pilots. Not the sons of samurai families or naval officers. Those positions were already filled. They needed competent young men who could follow orders, endure hardship, and weren't afraid of dying. Nakajima volunteered. Not out of patriotic fervor or dreams of glory, but because farm work had convinced him that spending his life bent over rice paddies was a slower death than anything he'd face in a cockpit. The Navy accepted him. They gave him a physical exam, eyes perfect, reflexes excellent, weight appropriate for the cramped cockpits of carrier-based fighters. They sent him to Chuchiura Air Training School. The training was designed to break men. 60-hour weeks of classroom instruction in aircraft mechanics, navigation, weather, and tactics. Physical conditioning that left recruits vomiting in the barracks. Flight instruction in obsolete biplanes where mistakes meant immediate dismissal. 73 men started training with Nakajima. 41 graduated. The rest washed out: poor eyesight, insufficient discipline, inability to master instrument flight, fear that manifested as hesitation during aerobatic maneuvers. Nakajima survived because he had the one quality that no amount of training could instill: he could predict what an aircraft would do before it did it. Some pilots flew by the instruments. Some flew by feel. Nakajima flew by understanding the invisible forces acting on his aircraft at every moment: thrust, drag, lift, weight, and how those forces shifted as speed and altitude changed. His instructors noticed. They assigned him to fighters. In October 1942, fresh from training, Petty Officer 3rd Class Nakajima reported to the aircraft carrier Zuikaku to fly the A6M Zero. The Zero was a revelation. After training in heavy, underpowered biplanes, the Zero felt like something alive, responsive, light, capable of aerobatic maneuvers that seemed to defy gravity. It could loop, roll, and turn with a grace that made flying feel less like operating machinery and more like dancing with physics. But the instructors were very clear about the Zero's limits. The aircraft was stressed for positive 7G maneuvers, meaning the pilot could pull back on the stick and subject the aircraft to 7 times the force of gravity in a turn. But it was only stressed for negative 2.5G, meaning pushing forward on the stick to create downward acceleration could only be done gently, briefly, or the aircraft would suffer structural failure. Never push hard forward on the stick. Never execute violent negative G maneuvers. Never exceed the aircraft's structural limits. The Nakajima Ki 43 engine used a float carburetor, a design where fuel floated in a chamber and was drawn into the engine by vacuum. This design worked perfectly during level flight and positive G maneuvers. But during negative G maneuvers, when the aircraft pitched nose down violently, the fuel would slosh away from the pickup point. The engine would starve. It would cough, sputter, and cut out entirely. American engines used fuel injection systems that worked regardless of aircraft orientation. American pilots could push their aircraft into negative G dives without fear. Japanese pilots could not. This limitation was hammered into every Zero pilot: avoid sustained negative G maneuvers. If you must push forward on the stick, do it smoothly, gradually, and be prepared for the engine to cut out. Nakajima learned these limits. He respected them. He flew 23 combat missions between November 1942 and March 1943 without ever violating them. Then the Americans learned to fight differently. May 1943. Over the Solomon Islands, Nakajima's squadron engaged 6 American Wildcats. The Americans didn't turn fight. They dove, fired, and climbed away. When Japanese Zeros tried to follow them into dives, the American pilots pushed their aircraft into negative G maneuvers, violent pushovers that generated crushing downward acceleration. The Zeros couldn't follow. Their engines cut out. By the time the engines restarted, the Americans were gone, repositioning for another attack. 3 Zeros were shot down. Not in turning dogfights. Not because American pilots outmaneuvered them. Because American pilots exploited a limitation Japanese doctrine had no answer for. By June 1944, Nakajima had seen this pattern repeat 47 times. American pilots dove, Japanese pilots hesitated because chasing them meant risking engine cutout, and American pilots climbed away safely to attack again. Following doctrine meant losing. But violating doctrine, executing the negative G maneuvers required to chase American fighters through their dives, meant risking engine failure, structural damage, and loss of control. Nakajima had never violated those limits. He'd watched men who did. Some succeeded. Most didn't. The ones who failed either ripped their aircraft apart through structural overstress or found themselves falling in an uncontrolled dive with a dead engine, unable to restart before they hit the ocean. But on June 19, 1944, at 1,347 hours, 23,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, watching 12 Hellcats converge on his formation, Nakajima realized something that changed everything. Following doctrine meant certain death. Violating doctrine meant probable death. But probable was better than certain. The Hellcats came in fast. Nakajima saw them first, 12 contacts at 25,000 feet, climbing out of the sun. He called them out over the radio. His squadron leader, Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Fukui, acknowledged and ordered the formation to climb to meet them. 8 Zeros versus 12 Hellcats. Not impossible odds if the Japanese could force a turning fight. Zeros could turn inside Hellcats all day. If they could get the Americans to turn. But the Americans didn't turn. At 24,000 feet, 4 Hellcats rolled inverted and dove, accelerating to over 400 knots. They fell on the Japanese formation like meteors, fired devastating bursts from 800 feet, then pulled up sharply and climbed away. 1-0 exploded instantly, hit in the fuel tank, igniting like a torch. Another shed pieces of wing and tumbled out of control. The remaining 6 scattered. Fukui ordered individual combat. Every pilot for himself. Nakajima broke right, pulling into a maximum performance turn. His Zero responded instantly, rolling 135 degrees per second, turning inside its own wingspan. A Hellcat tried to follow. It couldn't match the turn radius. Nakajima reversed, pulled the nose around, and fired a 2-second burst. Tracers arced past the Hellcat's tail, a miss. The Hellcat didn't try to turn fight. It dove. Straight down, nearly vertical, accelerating to speeds the Zero couldn't safely match. Nakajima knew better than to follow. Doctrine said, let them go. Conserve altitude. Reform with your wingman. But there was no wingman. Nakajima glanced left, right, saw nothing but empty sky. His formation was gone, scattered, engaged, or dead. Another Hellcat dove on him from above. Nakajima saw the tracers first, bright orange streaks that seemed to move in slow motion. He pulled hard left, felt the G-forces slam him into his seat, felt the aircraft groan under the stress. The Hellcat overshot, unable to turn tightly enough to follow. It pulled up, climbing away. Standard American tactic. Dive, shoot, climb. Never stay in the fight long enough for the Zero to use its turning advantage. Nakajima was alone, surrounded by Hellcats executing coordinated boom and zoom attacks. He could turn. He could dodge. He could waste altitude trying to avoid their diving attacks. But he couldn't win. Not like this. Doctrine had no answer for this tactic. Doctrine assumed Americans would dogfight. They didn't. A third Hellcat dove. Nakajima pulled into another high G turn, felt the airframe shudder, saw the American pilot overshoot again. But now Nakajima was at 18,000 feet. He'd lost 5,000 feet of altitude in 2 minutes. The Hellcats had lost none. They dove, then climbed back to their perch and repeated. This was how Japanese pilots died. Not in glorious turning dogfights. In slow, grinding attrition where they dodged and turned and bled altitude until they were too low to maneuver and American guns finished them. Nakajima saw the pattern. Saw his death written in the geometry of the engagement. And saw one possible escape. The maneuver that flashed through Nakajima's mind was called the gyaku-hanten, the inverted reversal. It wasn't secret. It wasn't unknown. Every Zero pilot had seen it demonstrated during training. And every Zero pilot had been explicitly forbidden from using it in combat. The theory was simple. When an enemy fighter dove past you, instead of turning to follow, which was slow and inefficient, you could roll inverted, pull -G to pitch the nose down violently, then roll upright while diving after the opponent. Done correctly, it was the fastest way to reverse direction and pursue a diving enemy. Faster than any positive G turn. Done incorrectly, it would kill you. The problems were numerous and fatal. First, structural stress. Rolling inverted and pulling hard created -G forces the Zero wasn't designed to handle. The wings were built to withstand 7G pulling up, not 7G pushing down. Overstress the -G limit, and the wings would fold upward and tear off. Second, engine cutout. The violent -G pitch would starve the float carburetor. The engine would die. Restarting required specific procedures. Mixture rich, throttle back, wait for fuel flow to restore. That took precious seconds during which the aircraft would be in an uncontrolled descent. Third, disorientation. Rolling inverted, pulling -G, then rolling upright while diving required perfect spatial awareness. Pilots who lost track of their orientation ended up in spins or inverted dives they couldn't recover from. Fourth, altitude loss. The maneuver sacrificed altitude brutally. If executed below 10,000 feet, there often wasn't enough altitude to recover before hitting the ocean. For these reasons, the gyaku-hanten was demonstrated during training as an example of what not to do. Instructors would perform it carefully, under controlled conditions, to show students the limits of the aircraft. and they would explicitly forbid students from attempting it in combat. This maneuver exists at the edge of the Zero's capability, the instructor said. It requires perfect timing, perfect execution, and perfect conditions. In combat, you will have none of these. If you attempt this and fail, you die. If you attempt this and succeed, you sacrifice so much altitude that you become vulnerable to every other enemy in the sky. Never use this maneuver. It is forbidden. Nakajima had absorbed that prohibition completely. He'd flown 22 months without once considering violating it. But at 1,349 hours on June 19, 1944, at 16,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, with a Hellcat climbing away after another diving attack, Nakajima realized the prohibition was based on peacetime assumptions. Don't use this maneuver because it's too risky. Too much can go wrong. But what did too risky mean when following doctrine guaranteed death? The Hellcat that had just attacked him was climbing back to altitude, preparing for another pass. Standard procedure. The American pilot assumed Nakajima would try to turn, would try to climb, would do anything except follow him down. If Nakajima could execute the gyaku-hanten perfectly, roll inverted, pull -G, reverse into a dive, and somehow keep the engine running or restart it fast enough, he could follow the Hellcat down, possibly get inside the American's turning circle during the pullout, possibly get a firing solution. Probably die trying. But probably was better than the certainty of staying at 16,000 feet while Hellcats took turns diving on him. Nakajima made his decision in less than 1 second. Not because he was brave. Because he'd run out of safe options. The Hellcat was 2,000 feet above, beginning its dive. Nakajima rolled inverted. The world flipped. Sky became ocean. Ocean became sky. The horizon rotated 180 degrees and Nakajima's inner ear screamed that he was falling. He pulled forward on the stick, not gently, not smoothly, but hard and fast. The aircraft pitched down violently. -G forces slammed him against his restrained harness. Blood rushed to his head. His vision began to gray at the edges. The Zero's nose dropped through the horizon. The airspeed indicator climbed, 200 knots, 220, 240. Then the engine coughed. The smooth roar of the Nakajima Sakai engine stuttered, misfired, and died completely. The propeller windmilled uselessly. The cockpit went silent except for the wind screaming past the canopy. Nakajima was inverted, in a 60-degree dive, with no power, at 15,000 feet. He had approximately 8 seconds before the situation became unrecoverable. Most pilots would panic. Most pilots would pull back on the stick, trying to stop the dive. That would kill them. Without power, without sufficient airspeed, pulling up would bleed energy and send the aircraft into an inverted stall. Nakajima did the opposite. He rolled the aircraft upright while maintaining the dive. The world flipped again, ocean above, sky below, then snapping back to normal orientation. He was diving at 70 degrees nose down, the ocean growing larger, the airspeed passing 280 knots. Still no engine power. Nakajima's hands moved automatically through the restart sequence. Mixture to full rich, throttle to idle, wait for the fuel to flow back to the carburetor, prime the engine with 3 pumps, then advance throttle smoothly. The engine coughed. Sputtered. Caught. The propeller bit air and the Zero's nose pulled slightly upward from the propeller torque. Nakajima had power again. He'd lost 6,000 feet of altitude. He was at 9,000 feet, diving at 300 knots, completely outside the envelope of normal combat maneuvering. But he was directly behind the Hellcat. The American pilot had expected Nakajima to turn or climb. He had not expected a Zero to follow him through a -G dive. Because Zeros didn't do that. Couldn't do that without killing their engines. Except Nakajima just had. The Hellcat pilot, realizing something was wrong, pulled out of his dive. A hard 5G pull, climbing back to safety. Nakajima followed, pulling his own 5G turn, the Zero responding with the tight turning radius that had made it famous. The Hellcat couldn't turn inside him. For a brief moment, maybe 3 seconds, Nakajima had a firing solution. He pressed the trigger. The 20mm cannons roared. Tracers arced across the sky, brilliant orange streaks that converged on the Hellcat's tail. 3 rounds hit. 1 shattered the tail surface. 2 punched through the fuselage. The Hellcat staggered, rolled hard left, and dove again, damaged but not destroyed. The American pilot was getting out of the fight, heading for the cloud cover below. Nakajima let him go. He'd expended too much altitude. He was at 7,000 feet now, with 11 more Hellcats somewhere above him. He'd executed a forbidden maneuver, survived it, and possibly damaged an American fighter. A tactical success that would be forgotten in the larger disaster of the engagement. The Hellcat pilot was Lieutenant Commander James Jimmy Thatch, leader of VF-3, one of the most experienced fighter squadrons in the Pacific Fleet. Thatch had 267 combat hours. He'd shot down 6 Japanese aircraft. He'd invented the Thatch weave. He knew how Zeros fought. He knew their capabilities, their limitations, their standard tactics. What had just happened made no sense. Thatch's wingman, Lieutenant J.G. Robert Duncan, came over the radio. "Skipper, you all right?" "What was that?" Thatch checked his instruments. Hydraulic pressure dropping. Tail control sluggish. 3 hits, probably 20mm, probably from that Zero. The Zero that had somehow followed him through a dive that should have killed its engine. "I'm okay," Thatch said. "That Zero, did you see it?" "Negative, Skipper. I was engaged with 2 others." Thatch pulled into a gentle climb, heading for the cloud layer at 5,000 feet. The rest of his squadron was scattered across 20 miles of sky, chasing the remaining Japanese fighters. But Thatch's mind was replaying what he'd just seen, the Zero rolling inverted. The sharp negative G pitch. The dive that followed, a dive that should have left the Zero with a dead engine, falling out of control. Instead, the Zero had recovered, maintained the dive, and ended up on Thatch's tail with a firing solution. Impossible. Or at least, it should have been impossible. Zero engines quit during negative G maneuvers. That was a known fact, confirmed by dozens of engagements, documented in intelligence reports. American pilots had been taught to exploit this weakness, dive hard, push negative G, and the pursuing Zero's engine would cut out. But this Zero's engine hadn't quit. Or if it had, the pilot had restarted it so quickly that it made no tactical difference. Thatch reached the cloud layer and ducked inside, concealing himself from any pursuing Japanese fighters. His tail felt mushy. He'd need to nurse the aircraft back to the carrier. But more than that, he'd need to report what he'd seen. That evening, aboard USS Lexington, Thatch filed his combat report. He described the engagement, the hits he'd taken, and the maneuver the Zero pilot had executed. The intelligence officer, a lieutenant commander who'd never flown combat, frowned as he read the report. "Commander Thatch, you're saying the Zero followed you through a negative G dive?" "That's correct." "And its engine didn't quit?" "If it did, he restarted it in less than 5 seconds." The intelligence officer made a note. "We've never observed this behavior before. Are you certain it was deliberate? Could this have been a mechanical failure that coincidentally put the aircraft into a dive?" Thatch thought about it. About the precision of the roll, the timing of the pull, the way the Zero had recovered and maintained pursuit. "It was deliberate," Thatch said. "That pilot knew exactly what he was doing." The intelligence officer nodded. "I'll include this in the squadron report. Naval intelligence will want to review it." The report went to SINCPAC, then to the Naval Technical Mission. Analysts cross-referenced it with other combat reports from June 19th. They found 3 other instances where Zero pilots had executed similar maneuvers, inverted rolls followed by negative G dives. 1 had worked. 2 had resulted in the Zero crashing into the ocean, apparently after losing control during the maneuver. The conclusion: some Japanese pilots are attempting high-risk evasive maneuvers that violate standard doctrine. Success rate appears low. Recommend continued exploitation of boom-and-zoom tactics. Japanese pilots who attempt these maneuvers either succeed rarely or die frequently. The report was filed. The war continued. No changes were made to American fighter doctrine. Nakajima didn't chase the damaged Hellcat. He climbed back to 12,000 feet, scanning for enemies, finding none immediately nearby. The sky was full of vapor trails, distant aircraft, the haze of battle. Nakajima's radio crackled with Japanese voices, scattered reports, calls for help, emergency transmissions cut short. He saw a Zero falling in flames, 2,000 feet below. He couldn't tell whose. He saw 3 Hellcats flying in formation, 3 miles to the east, searching for targets. He saw empty sky to the west. Nakajima turned west and ran. Not cowardice. Survival mathematics. He was alone, low on fuel, with 8 rounds remaining in his 20mm cannons. Remaining in the engagement meant dying for no tactical gain. He descended to wave-top height and flew west at maximum cruise speed, watching his fuel gauge drop, knowing he'd barely make it back to his carrier if it hadn't already been sunk. He flew for 90 minutes, saw no other aircraft, and finally spotted the carrier Zuikaku, damaged, listing slightly, but still operational. He landed with 14 gallons of fuel remaining. After landing, Nakajima climbed out of his cockpit and inspected his aircraft. The Zero had survived the gyaku-hanten without structural damage, but the airframe showed stress fractures in 3 places, hairline cracks in the wing spars where the negative G forces had nearly exceeded the structural limits. The aircraft was still flyable, but it had been pushed beyond its design parameters. A mechanic saw the cracks and shook his head. "What did you do to this airplane?" Nakajima didn't answer. The debriefing was short. Lieutenant Commander Fukui, who had also survived, asked each pilot to describe their engagements. When it was Nakajima's turn, he described encountering multiple Hellcats, executing evasive maneuvers, and damaging 1 enemy aircraft before disengaging. He did not mention the gyaku-hanten. He did not describe rolling inverted or pulling negative G or restarting his engine during a dive. Fukui didn't ask for details. He was too exhausted. Too defeated. Of the 8 Zeros that had engaged 12 Hellcats, 3 had returned. 5 pilots were missing, presumed dead. The Americans had lost 0 aircraft. That was the Battle of the Philippine Sea in miniature. A slaughter dressed up as combat. The statistics were even worse than the individual engagements suggested. Over 2 days, Japanese naval aviation lost 476 aircraft. American forces lost 29. Nakajima's survival meant nothing in the context of that catastrophe. Nobody celebrated his forbidden maneuver because nobody knew about it. And even if they had known, it wouldn't have mattered.